Many thanks for staying with us. And right about now, we are going to be having our conversation talking about Africa economy, debt burden, and possible relief. That is our topic for today. And our talking point would be South Africa's economy, or South Africa economy, the state of the nation. And also, we will be weighing into the benefits from social grants and relieves distress. Are there benefits from it? And again, we will be talking about Kenya debt crisis as a case study, of course, following what is happening in that nation today. And so joining us remotely online is Gabriel CROUSE. He's a fellow of the Institute of Race Relations, and he is also a policy analyst. Gabriel CROUSE is executive director of IRR Legal, and he's a fellow at the Institute of Race Relations, like I did say, and he holds, of course, a degrees and, of course, a degree in philosophy from Princeton University. And he's joining us this morning to weigh in the situation in Africa. Thank you so much, Gabriel.
Thank you very much for having me. Greetings.
Yes, thank you so much. It's good to have you join us on today's program. Now, there's so much happening in Africa. I want to start with South Africa because that's where you are right now. And South Africa just had their elections and recently. And so South Africa challenges in 2024 could be, be states owned entity. There's certain factors or issues that have been pointed out as some of the challenges facing the South Africa. And so one of them, of course, we have issues of state-owned utility, political tensions, service delivery, climate change, as well as social wage. And these are some of the things that the people have mentioned or are expecting the government to weigh in on. And so South Africa has invested, of course, significantly in social wage package to reduce inequality, address effects of poverty. But before I go into that question, first of all, tell us how the political terrain is after the election. What is South Africa like politically?
I think at the moment that it is really just a big question mark. We have, for the first time, a hung parliament, meaning no party gained a majority. The ANC came down from about 57% in 2019 to 39-40%. And so it feels the need to cobble together some kind of coalition government. And the negotiations around that are currently ongoing. Reports this morning say that the Democratic Alliance, which is the sort of liberal, business-friendly, meritocratic opposition party, has been offered 6 cabinet positions and 7 deputy cabinet positions, including the Deputy Minister of Finance, which I think is going to be important given our topic this morning on public debt and so on. But at the same time, the Economic Freedom Fighters, a radical Marxist race nationalist organization, and Umkhonto we Sizwe, the party of the former President Jacob Zuma, which said we reject the South African Constitution and seems to want KwaZulu-Natal to break off from the rest of the country, just had its members of parliament sworn in, meaning they swore to defend the Constitution that they campaigned to reject. Those two parties have reportedly been reapproached in the negotiations to form a new coalition government. So you have huge question marks at the moment. No one really knows for sure where the chips are going to land. There's great hope, I think, speaking to ordinary South Africans, especially those South Africans in the precariat, the jobs that put people in a position where they can own a cell phone and maybe even own a car and a low-cost residence, but are struggling to stay there because they're in debt, because if they lose an income for a month or two, they don't have the savings to stay afloat. People in those positions that I've spoken to have repeatedly said what South Africa needs most is a turn away from the kind of ideological policies that towards the end of the last 5 years seem to take over, and needs to get back to basics, needs to help investment, needs to help manage the environment for dealing with crime, issues like that, so that there can be more money, so that there can be more jobs. And that's not just anecdotal. The Institute of Race Relations has commissioned polling since 2013 every other year. And each time we ask the question, what's the biggest problem in the country? There's always one answer: jobs. We have the highest unemployment rate, and that's the thing that everyone
Okay,
wants the
now,
government to solve.
right, thank you for that start. Now, you said no one really knows where the chip is going to land. That creates a kind of uncertainty in the environment. But before the elections in May, during the State of the Nation address by the President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, he did give some things which, of course, I want to let's have them on the screen, talking about the South Africa's social grants. You know, you mentioned things about jobs, talked about service delivery and things, what the people are expecting. And during his State of the Nation address, he says 232 billion in social grants had been, will be released. Social relief of distress grants reaches 8.5 million people. And we also have that, please, let's put up that graphics of the South Africa's social grants there. It says 19 million people benefit from social grants. And we have figures like 3.95 million for old age pension grants, 1 million for disability grants, 13.2 million child support grants, 302,000 foster child grants, and the rest of them like we have there displayed on the screen. But my question is, in the State of the Nation address, the president also says that it is the job of the states to provide a minimum level of protection below which no South African will fall. How do you react to that, talking about these grants? Is it really what the people need? Will it help, the situation or the economic situation or status of South Africa? What's your take on that statement?
Thank you. I think it's slightly too complicated to say it's right or wrong. There's a part that's right and there's a part that's wrong. What is true is that as South Africans, we have a duty insofar as we can to pay our taxes to the government, and for the government to use some of those taxes to help the poorest and the most needy to avoid the most dire circumstances. No one should be dying of starvation, although it is a fact that 1.7 million children of the youngest ages already suffer stunted growth due to malnutrition in South Africa. So, we have quote unquote the richest mile in Africa, in Sandton, the deepest financial markets on the continent, but we also have 1.7 million children that are starving. And that is not something that any South African can tolerate. On the other hand, there is a great risk to trying to use handouts as a way to solve the problem. They're not sustainable, and they are, even at the moment, fundamentally lacking in kind of the ability to do the job that they aim to do. So what you were saying earlier, you said 8.5 million, just to be clear, 8.5 million households and 19 million South Africans are receiving grants. That is far more than the number of South Africans that have jobs. There is no country that I know of on the planet where there are more grant recipients than workers. All of that money going to the grants has to come from the workers. And the risk that South Africans face is that the money paying out various things, it should be paying for grants, to be clear, but it's also paying for other government interventions that are supposed to help the poor that are not doing it. And if you add all the money up that we're paying, we aren't able to afford it. So how do we do it? As the government, we borrow. And the borrowing cost has become the largest line item. Not paying back the principal, just paying back the interest has come to cost more than the annual payments for all public schools, more than the annual payments for all child grants. So you were saying there that the total grant number that Ramaphosa was talking about was 230 billion. Well, the total annual interest payments are pushing on 360 billion. That is significantly more. That means every time 1 rand is going to pay for a grant, 1 rand 20 is going to pay back interest to some rich banker who lent the money to pay the grant. That is a formula ultimately for redistributing money from the poor to the rich, from locals to abroad, where those financial reserves are speculated on in international currency, forex exchange markets, and bond markets. So this is not a sustainable solution. What most South Africans appreciate is if we're going to get ourselves out of the hole, where most people, most men, my age, I'm 34, most men between 15 and 35 have not got a job. It looks like 2 million have never had a job. That is not something that can be solved with 350 Rand a month grant, which can buy you maybe 10 meals or maybe 12 meals. There's a whole other, 20 days where you're getting nothing, even if you're eating 1 meal a day on those days where you are getting it. It's not a sustainable solution. And part of the hope is that the incoming administration is going to learn a bit of humility. It's a classic problem to think there's poverty. The government must solve the problem by spending money, by intervening, by deciding who gets a job, by deciding what should the price be for bread. But that formula has been tried over and over again throughout the 20th century, including in the Soviet Union, including across a lot of Europe. And each and every time it produced greater inequality and greater poverty, because the simple fact is when bureaucrats, when government politicians make a mistake, they don't lose their jobs. Whereas if a business makes a fundamental mistake, it loses the customers. And so there's a very immediate corrective measure that keeps businesses making the serious efforts to add value to lure customers towards them, which politics doesn't have. Our government, in short, has basic duties that it has to fulfill that private business can't do. The government has to keep people safe. It's not doing that in South Africa. The murder rate has been increasing over the last 5 years. The government also has to protect the poorest of the poor. And so the money that it does extracting taxes needs to be directly funneled and not mediated. That's why we like the grants, but we don't like the programs that come around it. And the government has to educate people. But South Africa's public school system is rated as the worst in the world on a bang for buck basis. On the Pearls International Survey, we have the worst outcomes on child literacy. 80% of children in grade 4 or 5 can't read. And yet we spend among the most on education in the public school system, after debt repayments is the highest line item in the budget, of emerging markets. So, that's a classic example where the issue clearly isn't money. There are countries in Africa that spend a lot less money on education and are getting a lot better results because that money is going directly to teaching the children and not going through such a series of hands on the way to get there.
Okay, thank you so much, George. But if borrowing is not a sustainable solution, what then? Because we've seen the South African governments have actually increased the social grants. They say one of the reasons is to cushion the impact of against poor, or the poor against rising inflation. Now, we also see, you said so much, thank you so much for that. And because we see the same thing playing out in different African countries. Here in Nigeria, we see a lot of government policies also being reeled out, and all in the name to, help the economy grow or stabilize. And at the same time, they're reeling out a lot of social safety or social welfare initiatives to help cushion the effects of such policies on the poor. And we see the same thing happening in Kenya, where, as we speak, Kenya is, going through a lot right now. Just recently, the president has withdrawn the finance bill. He says he's not going to sign it. And we see how the people protested because they had increased tax. And that has to do with the burden in terms of debt the country is trying to repay loans to the IMF. Of course, one of the conditions of the IMF given to increase taxes. And so if borrowing is not a sustainable solution, what then? Can you give us a little insight? What would be a suggestion or advice to African nations or leaders?
Thank you. I think the key idea is to find where value is and do what you can for that value to express itself, to be realized, and then to compound. And in African countries, in South Africa that I know best, but I think this holds far more broadly, the most underappreciated value really is human value. Ordinary people, entrepreneurs making ends meet are the most valuable resource, the most untapped valuable resource in Africa. What we have under the ground, what we have in the sky, that's all very interesting and useful. But really, people power is what was, not allowed to thrive in Africa, which is why this continent finds itself in last place in the GDP per capita stakes. And the way to get that to change, I think, is to learn from the successes of countries. You can start with South Korea, you can look at India, you can look at Singapore, you can look at some of the success stories in South America. You can look at the successful moments that we have had in Africa, including some of the good programs in Nigeria, some of the good programs in Kenya. And each time, I think that there have been bursts of serious growth in jobs, in economic activity. The key principle that's been adhered to is for ingenuity, entrepreneurship, and go get 'em business acumen that already exists in African countries, amongst African people, to be allowed, to be permitted by the government to thrive. That means the government stays out of the way, excepting to stop criminality. That's its fundamental function. So, in South Africa's context, I wrote a paper, an economic paper, arguing that we should cut taxes. In particular, we should cut taxes on the trade, the sort of value added tax, and on petrol, because in South Africa, we have ordinary people paying some of the highest costs on petrol and on transport relative to their income in the world. Why is that? It's not a surprise. Apartheid was a system that tried to keep black people very far away from work. And there have been some changes subsequently, but a lot of South Africans live very far away from work. How do they get to work? In minibus taxis. How does the government extract taxes on that? Through the petrol tax. Almost half of the money that people pay for petrol is going straight to the government. This is kind of crazy because the poorest pay the most of that tax. The same for the value added tax. Now, our government wants to introduce a new national health insurance system where the government is going to buy every bit of medicine in the whole country. It already doesn't know how to run the electricity and has driven that into a corrupt state. It's going to do the same with hospitals. And how does it want to fund it? By increasing the value added tax, which is disproportionately paid by poor people buying basic goods. That is the kind of thinking that I think has gotten a lot of African countries into trouble. The government's going to solve all the problems by taking all the money and then spending it more wisely than ordinary Africans can. We say you should do the opposite. The government should allow ordinary Africans to spend the money and to make the businesses that's going to change that money, because ordinary Africans are much more intelligent and much more productive than most African governments. I think that in Kenya, part of the concern is that people have been killed to stop that finance bill from going through. They're so badly in the hole where 50% of their budget is being spent on repaying interest on government debt because of past Kenyan leadership decisions to have the government run more and more and more of the economy and to drive private capital out. Subsequently, Kenya has had a bit of a change in direction, but it's suffering the consequences of past bad decisions. And the full answer that I must say, in honesty, is that when bad decisions have been made in the past, you can't do anything to make it all work today, to make it all work tomorrow. There has to be an understanding of time horizons that expand over years, and for some things, even over decades. For South Africa to have a national health insurance where the government can competently purchase all medicine to make sure that everyone can get the highest quality cancer treatment equal to what you get in Sweden or Japan would be a wonderful thing to have today or tomorrow. But that's just not going to happen. We can wait 1,000 years by allowing the government to take all the money now and misallocate it so that the economy doesn't grow. Or we can have that in 60 years if we allow ordinary African business people and customers to make the wise decisions necessary in order for economic activity to increase. So, being realistic is a key ingredient, and tapping into the most underappreciated source of value, which is human ingenuity, is the other key ingredient. I think a realistic combination of those two things is the best chance that African countries have of economic development.
Thank you so much, for that thoughts of yours, talking about being realistic and tap into Africa's ingenuity to solve some of these problems rather than just resort to, borrowing and exacerbating the economic situation of the country, which of course is bringing a lot of hardship to the people, and we see how the people are reacting to them. Now, before we let you go, please, let's talk about this present economy, because while we're talking about South Africa's economy, the state of the nation, and because we've talked so much about the Nigerian economy and of course what's happening in Kenya, we have said that it's as though African leaders playing the same script, like they are almost like doing the same thing, following the same economic policies to drive their economy or manage their economy. Now, let's talk about service delivery. After the election, this new coalition government in South Africa, and while we are addressing the state of the nation, so we don't see Africa, another giant of Africa, the most industrialized nation in Africa, go into, an economic distress. Now, talking about service delivery to the people, there is, of course, what we know, energy poverty. Over the years, we've seen how South Africa has been, there's this thing, the term load shedding. There's been a lot of energy poverty that is created. And also we see major issues as like water, shortage of water in South Africa. And what is the story? My question is, what is the story, and how can the people be reassured by this new government in place? What can be a game changer for the people of South Africa? The issue of energy poverty is very serious, and I can trace it to some climate change policies because, as we know, South Africa burns coal. Their power utility is mainly based on coal, and so it has been termed that coal is dirty energy, is fossil fuel. And so we see all of that playing out. So what would be a game changer for the people of South Africa moving forward?
I think, again, I'm going to aspect. So one of them is what has been termed state capture, and that is the name of a commission chaired by our current Chief Justice, Raymond Zondo, the State Capture Inquiry. And that was largely an inquiry into the ways in which government spending through SOEs and other forms of procurement was abused by government officials and private business getting into collusion and basically eating the money, to use a very South African term. And government spending annually is over 1 trillion rand. It is a huge amount. And Kenneth Brown, the former chief procurement officer, estimated about 2015 that 30 to 40% of that was being wasted through corruption. So that's 300 to 400 billion rand. Now, again, to go back to the statistic you mentioned at the start of this conversation, only 230 billion rand goes to social grants every year. So 230 billion to social grants, but 300 or 400 billion to corrupt politicians and private businessmen. That says something about how badly things have gone wrong. Part of the problem is that once an organization has been so fundamentally corrupted that that most people in it know if you do your job well, you're going to cause, and someone is going to find a way to remove you. If you do your job badly, then you're part of the team. It's very hard to change that kind of office culture. That is why one of the things that needs to happen is private competition needs to be allowed in. And that means, in my opinion, selling off Medupi and Kusile, which are the largest two coal-fired power plants in Africa, and they were the largest in the world at the time that they were being built. The designs were so complicated that it's very hard for even a good government to run them well. But as it is with a semi-competent government, they have been firing at half power almost throughout and are not entirely complete. Sell that off to, if it's a Japanese consortium or Canadian consortium, who cares? Just as long as it's sold to people who can make it really work. If those things fire full tilt, that would already make economic room for part of the growth that we need. However, there's another problem, number two, and this comes to the climate change issue. South Africa and America signed the Just Energy Transition Agreement at the start of last year. We were the first American partners on that plan to go from dirty coal to clean energy. Now, I endorse the idea that sustainable development means curbing pollution and being serious about the negative effects of fossil fuels. However, I think that as an African, the first priority in Africa has to be poverty alleviation. Swiss people, Swedish people, very rich people who already have enough food to feed all their children, can worry about such things as climate change in a way that we just can't afford to. With 1.7 million starving children, with most men not having a job, it's just the case that we have more urgent issues. Why do I say this? I say this because we pledged, as the South African government, to cut half of our coal-fired power stations off, just to turn them off by, I think, 2033. That would take the bad situation that we were already in, with load shedding being a seasonal come and go thing that crushes businesses, that stops factories from being opened, that stops new shopping centers from being built, new office parks from being developed, because you have to first put in the money to buying private generators, and you have to worry about how things are really going to work going forward. It's going to take this bad situation we're in and make it much worse if we do shut down, if we do stick to that promise. On the other hand, if we don't stick to the promise, then we're going to get interest rate penalties on the loans that we've made to install some of the solar power generating facilities that have come through the Just Energy Transition deal. It was a terrible, terrible promise to make. I look at people like Bjorn Lomborg, Danish guys based in the UK, who he's serious about climate change, but he says Africa has got to prioritize poverty alleviation before getting to the green issues. And we just did exactly the opposite in South Africa. We signed a promise.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. You know, we need to go right now, but, you know, you just mentioned something very salient, but we need to hear more from you concerning this energy deal from South Africa, what they signed and how it's affecting people. And you said that what Africa should be prioritizing should be poverty alleviation. We should pay more attention to that. And so we would like to have more of this conversation, because it's very critical, because if you talk about the problems of Africa, or what's happening right now, these seems to be the problems that we are facing that's causing our economies to go on a decline. And so we need to address these issues, and our government should be accountable and also need to pay more attention and prioritize what is important at this point. But thank you so much for joining us on the program this morning on LN 24/7.
Pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And so there's so much to talk about. Africa must prioritize poverty alleviation. Africa must pay attention to the citizens, to what the people need. Africa leaders must wake up. And so that's the much we can bring on today's episode or edition of the Business Review. And of course, we'll be going further. The conversation will continue, because there's so much that we need to unpack so that Africa can actually be what it is meant to be. And thank you so much. Our guest has been Gabriel CROUSE, Fellow of the Institute of Race Relations, and also he is a policy analyst. Thank you, and that's the much we can bring to you on Business Review. And right about now, we bring you news on the hour. Stay with us. We'll be right back.